I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Professor Rafi Greenberg. He is a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. He's been there since 1998, and he's currently an honorary research associate at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. I was preparing myself to thank the University College London for funding his trip, but he tells me that it's actually Tel Aviv University who is making this trip possible. So we're very thankful. Professor Greenberg wears many hats in his academic life. I find all of them really interesting. On the one hand, he's an archaeologist of the early Bronze Age Levant, the broader Near East, and the Transcaucasus, with particular interests in migration and trade, social and economic aspects of ceramic production, and technologies of ceramic production. He has a major ongoing project on ceramic traditions of the Kura Araxes, or early Transcaucasian interaction spheres, reaching from the Levant to Armenia, funded generously by the Israel Science Foundation. And most recently, he's edited a volume on the Transcaucasian migrants and the Kirbat-Kerak culture. The second hat that Professor Greenberg has is that he has this ongoing archaeological excavation project that I think he's going to mention in the beginning of his talk at the early Bronze Age Levantine site of Tel Bet Yara, the House of the Moon, or Kirbet al-Karak, if you prefer the Arabic, ruins of the castle, it's a large and fortified early Bronze Age town in the northern Jordan Valley by the Lake Kinneret. A project that started in 2003 and resulting in many publications, including the first volume of reports published on the early Bronze Age mound at the site, and numerous articles. This is actually one of the most widely discussed early Bronze Age sites from all of the Near East, I think. Another hat that Professor Greenberg has is the one closer to my heart. And that is the politics of archaeological fieldwork in the Middle East, and that's what he's going to actually tell us about, particularly in the context of Israel-Palestine, and specifically in Jerusalem. He's an outspoken public intellectual on all of the controversial aspects of uncovering the past in the Holy Land. In one journal report on the excavations in the Palestinian neighborhood Silwan, he was quoted to say that the city of David is connected by its umbilical cord to politics. I really love that. Whether you said that. Sometimes journalists make things up, so I wasn't sure. So in his rather activist writings and interviews, he has shown us no matter how archaeologists deny political engagements in local contexts, they have responsibility to local communities, and with their funding sources, with their publication policies, with their surgical interventions to the land, they make a huge impact in the contemporary politics and society. I'm therefore particularly excited to welcome him at Brown, and using this occasion, since I have the floor, I want to make a note about an upcoming symposium workshop we're going to have here, to be hosted by the Middle East Studies program here at Brown in the next academic year, hopefully sometime around this time of the year next year, which will be the second iteration of the Engaged Scholarship, Ethics and Knowledge Production in the Middle East. And next year's event will be on the archaeological practice in context of conflict and war, with a specific focus on contemporary Iraq and Afghanistan, considering questions of ethics of working in war-torn countries and the ethical responsibilities of local communities, questions around militarization of archaeology, and embedded archaeologists and anthropologists in military units, the so-called human terrain systems. So I hope that we can convince Professor Greenberg to come join us for that event. But I'd like to mention that after Professor Greenberg's talk, we have a wine reception over here. You're all invited. And without further ado, I'd like to give you Professor Greenberg. The title of his talk is up there, The Archaeology and Identity in Modern Israel and Palestine.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. As were mentioned, I'm here on a funded trip, and the reason that I'm doing this trip is to plug our archaeological field school. And you're going to see these handouts in the reception. And these archaeological field schools are designed for US students, undergraduates, and they can get lots of academic credit at the field school, participating during the summer, digging and studying and doing seminars and traveling in Israel. So it's not only for archaeology students, it's for anyone who is an undergraduate, and you get plenty of credits and have a great time. And it's also, of course, a highly important scientific site, so all the good things. But because the people who invited me to Brown asked me to talk about this subject, I'm happy to talk about that as well. And in fact, I offered it as a possibility. So let's get right into it. The photo on this slide might not be familiar to you, but it comes from a very recent and very hyped exhibit at the Israel Museum, which opened a couple of weeks ago, on Herod the Great, or Herod the King of Judah, as it's known in Hebrew. And all the international reports on this exhibit focused on question, among other things, on the question of where the exhibit materials come from. And it was said that they had been taken from, many of them had been taken from the Palestinian territories, that the Israel Museum was looting Palestine in order to fill its coffers and things to that effect. But there's really much more to it than that. And this exhibit, which I will get back to later, is about how an exhibit, a museum, manipulates collective memory in order to promote a certain view of the past. And in this case, it's a distant and tamed and unthreatening past that is being promoted. And that past can be easily consumed, so that once you've seen the exhibit and you feel sort of sated and edified, you can go out to the gift shop and get a few souvenirs from the exhibit, and everybody's consuming it with, and feeling quite good at the end of this process. So this caused me to think about how archaeologists function as interpreters and as creators and as producers of collective memory. Now this quote from Lowenthal, David Lowenthal's "The Past is a Foreign Country," it's one of the favorite texts of heritage professionals, is a sort of double-edged sword here, because he says the prime function of memory is not to preserve the past, but to adapt it so as to enrich and manipulate the present. So that always things that we recall, what we choose to recall, what we succeed in recalling, is something that we use to as he says, to enrich and manipulate the present, and of course, the future as well. In other words, it gives us some sort of direction. And the reason I say it's two-edged is because, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, are we supposed to be manipulating and not preserving the past, but manipulating the present? Is that a negative statement or a positive statement? Or is it just a statement of how things work? Well, that's something I'd like to expand on in this talk. So archaeology is, in a sense, a form of collective memory. And how does that work? Well, memory is fundamental to identity, to the identity of the individual, and of the collective. If you take a person's memory away, he no longer knows who he is. Okay, we know that from films and from, psychological descriptions of what happens to people who lose their memory. They feel that, their identity, their personhood is being lost. If you take someone and lock them up in isolation and don't call them by their name and don't allow them to interact with anyone, they lose their sense of self. So that the memory is produced also through interaction with people. And in that sense, all memories are collective memories. Maurice Halbwach said this in very stark terms. He said that virtually all memories are collective memories. Even the personal ones are those that are created through our interaction with other people. People tell us, what happened in our past. I remember you when you were this big, that kind of stuff. You don't remember yourself, but you look at yourself in pictures and you're reminded who you were and what you are. And this works, of course, on the collective level, because as a community, as a group, we need to be reminded of who we are as well. We need to have some sort of shared past which makes us a group, which makes us a community. And it doesn't matter what kind of community it is, an intellectual community, an academic, a religious, national, etc. So we need constantly to tell ourselves and what the past was, and there are people within the society that function as those storytellers, as those who tell us about the past. So archaeologists are that kind of storyteller. And I just added this to my presentation because yesterday I visited with my uncle in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and he lives not far from Walden Pond. And at Walden Pond, which I assume is a sort of American landmark, this is part of the collective history, at least of New England. Everybody knows who Thoreau was. And people began remembering Thoreau. The Thoreau Society was set up in 1941, so nearly a century after he died. They had to recreate the memory of him, and this has to be a collective memory. It has to be shared by all Americans, or at least all those who visit the site. And what did they do in order to reconstruct the location of Thoreau's cabin on Walden Pond? They brought in an archaeologist way back in 1854. The archaeologist dug and identified the chimney, the bricks that belonged to the chimney of that house, and enabled this reconstruction is built away from the actual location. But here it is. Archaeologists are actually part of the process of retelling the past. Another function that I would like to add to the function of archaeologists as people who retell humanity and communities about their collective past is a special function of archaeology which should never be forgotten, and that is why people matter, why individual people matter, why even people who are not mentioned in the newspapers, why they matter. And this is something that occurred to me, I don't know, as I was walking along the street and wondering, what's going to be with me, who will remember me when I'm gone, that kind of thing. Everybody has those moments, right? And, okay, so I published books, that are distributed to 90 people or so. Is that what I'm going to be remembered by? And who cares about me? What about, the rest of the people on my block? Who's going to remember them? And I said, gee, what a great thing archaeologists do. We dig in some corner of a house and we find a hearth and a cooking pot, which a woman, was using 5,000 years ago. And we're using that material to tell the story of her community. If she knew, I think it would make her feel wonderful, that her legacy is being saved in this way. Just her everyday routine, the stuff that she does on the everyday, is being used to reconstruct an entire way of life and a part of human history. So that's something that archaeologists do that sometimes we tend to forget, but I think it might be one of the most important functions. Now, these two functions, providing collective memory and telling us what the individual means, what is the significance of the individual, are functions that in traditional societies were provided for in other ways. You didn't need archaeologists. And in fact, highly traditional societies still don't need archaeologists. So in an ultra-Orthodox society, or even in the Jewish Orthodox society that I grew up in, okay, our collective memory was reported in the texts, in the scriptures, in the legends, in the stories. So I knew where Judaism began. I had a book that my grandfather wrote. He was a conservative rabbi. And he wrote a book for teaching Hebrew, and it was called The First Jew. And the first line of that book is, Abraham was the first Jew. Easy. There isn't any, who needs archaeologists, right? You know what history is. And religion also taught us what our function was as individuals. There were certain things we had to carry out to be good persons, and to earn our share in the world to come. So that was quite clear. And because this was and is provided for in traditional societies, then the places where you find archaeologists and where archaeologists contribute to society is usually secular societies, societies that have left tradition behind. In another sense, archaeology is also very much a product of modern society. And that has to do with the fact that modernity sees a gulf between present and past. Present and future are divorced from the past. The past is something that is receding and disappearing, and we have to grab hold of it. This is not the same in other societies that don't have this linear view of human history. So it's very much a modern project. I know this is dangerous to say in this country, but archaeology is embedded in capitalism. Now, capitalism, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but capitalism is about growth, constant growth, and consumption. That's what capitalism is about. And perforce, the result of constant growth and consumption is constant destruction of the past. So we're always eating up whatever's there in order to produce this brave new world or this new future. And because we're all about growth and consumption, we're always being told how we need to enhance growth. And that destroys, it's always destroying, and in Israel, every new building that goes up is destroying some remnant of the ancient past. Then we're concerned, we're worried. We want to save that past. That past has to be saved. So this is almost a medical intervention to heal a rift, to heal this rift between present and past. So archaeologists are involved in that, and that's why I say that it's embedded in capitalism. In fact, a large part of the archaeological project takes place because of development and not because of research. So it is, for all these reasons, because it talks about collective memory, because it is modern, because it is embedded in capitalism, because it is secular, then archaeology is a modern enterprise that produces the past through selective remembering and forgetting. And as such, it is inherently political. Okay, it is not value-free. It is not something that is just out there to be discovered. It is something that is produced and made within a very specific context. Now, why do I say selective remembering and forgetting? That sounds dangerous, right? We don't want to be selective. We want to, as archaeologists, we want to collect everything and record everything and present everything. But it's selective, and I'll use an example from one of my favorite authors, Borges. He has a story called Funest, His Memory. Anybody familiar with that story? Funest. Funest is a figure who remembers everything. He remembers so much that you can ask him to describe a specific day in the past, and he will describe that day, and that description will take a full 24 hours. That's how good his memory is. But Funest is completely incapable of doing anything. And in fact, he dies when he's 24. He's a complete wreck. He's useless as a person, because you can't function with that kind of memory. You have to make a selection of what is important, what is worth remembering, and what you have to weed out. Okay, and that's something we do all the time in archaeology. Every single archaeological activity involves throwing something out and keeping something. And that activity is always selective. In the old days, we threw almost everything out and kept only the stones and the mosaics and the coins. And nowadays, we're taking a lot of the dirt home. But if we take all of the dirt home, or digitally reproduce every single millimeter of our archaeological site, we'll find ourselves with a huge amount of uninterpreted data that we can't say anything about. So that this selection enables us to tell a story. Now, who is archaeology working for? In many cases, many archaeologies and schools of archaeologies are placed in a national setting, in the setting of a nation, of a modern nation. And as you may know, modern nations are what we call imagined communities. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, but it means that in order for me to believe that I belong to the same community as someone living in Los Angeles, I have to imagine some kind of unity, some kind of society that we all belong to, even though I never met these people. And I never met hardly any of the 300 million American co-citizens, that belong to this imagined community, and the same is true of smaller communities. So every nation is an imagined community in that sense, and in archaeology, working within a national framework is often asked to provide a shared past for that imagined community. So if I want to be quite cynical, I can say, in sort of Marxist terms, that archaeology provides false consciousness of a shared past for imagined communities. Okay, we need a shared past, something we can say, this is us, way back in the past. We do this by selection, so we create it, or we produce it at least. It's not that we create the testimony, but we select the relevant testimony. And we do it for communities, that are not sort of natural constructs, but they're political and social constructs. And often, in order to do this, and in order to be supported in our work, and in order for people to like us, we do it in a way which creates a sort of tame past that can be easily consumed. Okay? History Channel, Discovery Channel, easy consumption. Don't do things that are threatening, that will undermine the consensus. So this is what often happens. I don't say it always happens, it doesn't have to happen, but it is often the case. Now, coming to Israel itself, it is almost a sort of truism that Israeli archaeology has been deeply involved in nation building in Israel. Everyone says it, and it's probably true to a great extent, at least up to today, including today. But this sort of intimates that, it's often said with a sense that, oh, isn't that awful that Israeli archaeology is just rebuilding their idea of the nation? What they should do, those Israelis, is an objective and worthy archaeology that treats everyone equally. Well, obviously that can't happen. There isn't any such archaeology. There isn't any such, pure, unadulterated, untouched archaeology that someone can create. Because we're always making the selection, and we're always serving a certain kind of community. So we have to make these decisions, and we need to be guided by values. So all our archaeology is going to be guided by certain values. I wanted to show this slide as an example of how archaeology is used in another classic case which has been written about extensively, which is Greece. The nation of Greece was reimagined and reinvented in the 19th century. And archaeology developed with it. Yanis Chamilakis wrote an excellent book called The Nation and Its Ruins. And it follows step by step how archaeology was used in recreating modern Greece, a Greece which never existed in history. It had to be recreated, and an archaeology for it was created. And the clever thing about this slide, which I borrowed from a colleague, is that you see here the tomb of Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, the purported tomb of Philip II, which became a real focus of nationalist fervor, an archaeological find that became a symbol for Greece. And at bottom left, you can see a stamp of another Macedonia. So there's Macedonia in Greece, and there's another Macedonia, which is in former Yugoslavia, another republic, which also claims the same past as the foundation of their nation. So even here we can see this, this striving. As the nations develop, as they become defined as nations, they're looking for their past. Phil Cole has talked and written about this extensively in recent years in the Caucasus and in the areas of the post-Soviet republics, where even now histories are being rewritten as national histories to sort of denigrate or deny the Soviet version of history and produce a new national history for states like Kazakhstan and Georgia, etc. Now, my contention is that if we come back to Israel and Palestine, traditional Palestinian society has so far had little use for archaeology because they're traditional and because they have other ways of defining their identity. But I predict, for what it's worth, that as Palestinians move toward nationhood, insofar as they move towards nationhood, we don't know if that's going to happen, but as they create their imagined community, they will also have a national Palestinian school, a school or National Palestinian School of Archaeology. And that they too will be using archaeology to create their own version of a shared past. And we also have an idea of what that will look like because they talk about it, the Palestinian intellectuals talk about it. They talk about defining themselves as indigenous people, as local people, as Canaanites who withstood the ebb and flow of world cultures, but they remained on the ground and actually represent something that is fundamental to the country. And this is as much invented and as much true as other versions. I don't think there's anything fundamentally impossible about it, but it is also a value-laden concept of what the past is about. So, the conclusion of this part of my talk is that there's little point in complaining about the fact that Western archaeology produces rather than discovers the past. It's a long, ongoing discussion, and I think we can show that archaeology produces a past. This doesn't mean there isn't any tangible past. I'm not going to talk so much about that, but if someone wants to bring that up as a question, we can get back to it. What is tangible? But the fact that archaeology is producing rather than discovering the past, there's little point in complaining about that. That's what archaeology is. That's what archaeology does. If you want to change that, you actually have to change archaeology itself. And because archaeology is all those things I said before, it's going to produce the past. And if you want archaeology to do something else, you have to rethink archaeology. I hope you're with me so far. So what can be controlled is what kind of past is going to be described and what kind of identity is going to be produced through archaeology. That's something that we can control. And I brought in another quote from Lowenthal in which he says, "We require a heritage with which we can interact." That is, we have control over this heritage that we're going to produce, and we have to make a heritage that is consistent with our vision of what is important in the present and the future. So what I have discovered over the past few years that archaeology is more about the future, or as much about the future as it is about the past, paradoxical as this may sound. So I would like to suggest, and just to keep things simple, that there are three general categories of identity that archaeology can and does produce. And we'll sort of judge them, okay? I'm going to pronounce judgment on them. And these three categories that I will present here are national and ethnic. That's one category. That is an archaeology that focuses on either the nation or the people as a unit that is worthy of study. The second category would be a globalized identity. That is, globalized but in the modern sense. That is, archaeology or as part of the world's heritage. We're all in this together, we're all human, and we're all, we're a family. All humanity is one big family, one big happy family. And the third category I would like to call local, which is based on a specific place or a region and the people who are actually there right now. Extant, people, and places. Places as they are with whoever's in them. Okay, those are the three categories of identity that I'd like to talk about. National and ethnic, globalized, and local. And I'm going to bring a few samples now from Israel proper regarding these three attitudes. Now, national, the use of archaeology to produce national identities, and I say that that's been a criticism leveled at Israel, and it's to a certain extent true, is very much more present in the outward face of archaeology, the way archaeology is presented for popular consumption, than in the internal discourse within archaeology. If you took Israeli archaeologists, who may have been active in presenting a sort of national past, if you went and looked at their books, or their discussions, or their courses, or their classes, they're almost never about that. So the guy talking, Yadin might talk about Masada and the importance of the symbol, but his class is going to be about, I don't know, 3 types of cooking pot found in the cistern, locus 118 at Masada. That's his course. So there's some sort of discrepancy there, which archaeologists tended not to take too much responsibility for. They said, our business is the cooking pot, what you guys make out of it is your problem. But I'm going to bring 2 examples of how that happens anyway, and then I'll say something about ethnicity, which is slightly different. So this is a case of a site called Avdat in the central Negev, the Negev highlands in Israel. You can see where it is on the map. And this site was purportedly founded by Nabateans. It was an important Nabatean center. Nabateans are tribes of Arabian origin that spread into the Levant during the Roman period. Founded by Nabateans, and then under the Byzantines, that is under the Christian empire of the Byzantines, it became an important military and economic center. And yet this site, which purportedly was founded by Arabs and made famous by Christians, was a Zionist icon. So much so that a wine was called after it. A ship of the line in the Israeli merchant marine was called Avdat. It was used in advertisements to symbolize the renewal of Israel itself, of the state in the Negev. How did that happen? Because Avdat was taken as a symbol of a community of self-sufficient, independent, rebellious, innovative agriculturalists who resisted Roman rule and created their own paradise in the Negev. That's how it was presented. I'm basing my statement here on an MA dissertation by a student of mine, Menachem Schiff, who has also written about this in past and present recently online. So this was used because David Ben-Gurion had an ideology that Israel and the Zionist enterprise needs to make the desert bloom. They wanted to find a precedent for that, and they chose the Nabatean precedent. They ignored other parts of that context. They forgot that they were Arabs. They emphasized the fact that they were able to make the desert bloom, and it became a symbol, so much so that the site was heavily vandalized recently as part of inter-ethnic rivalries within the Negev, which I'll get back to later on. So this is in the 50s and 60s. The site of Avdat is being used as a national symbol. Another much more recent example, and this long text, if you have time to read it, is a sort of prose poem written by our Prime Minister, based on a seal that was found 3 or 4 years ago in an excavation in Jerusalem. And the excavation happens to have Netanyahu's name Netanyahu on it. Netanyahu, you have to understand, is an invented name of our Prime Minister. I mean, he wasn't born with that name, he chose that name. But this became the foundation of this very, I think, clever weaving together of past and politics and national unity and so on, just to reach the bottom line, which is Jerusalem cannot be divided. You know, it is our capital. So this is a way in which antiquities are still used in this sort of in-your-face national way. But within Israeli archaeology, there's another, I don't know if it's insidious or dangerous, but another current that is really quite dominant in the Israeli approach to archaeology, and that is that sites are always identified ethnically. When sites are excavated, you immediately give them a label. You say, this is a Jewish site, this is a Muslim site, this is a Nabatean site, and so it goes, you know, for every single period. And when you excavate, as I do, in periods where the people have no names, then it seems that it's not even worth talking about. So people will come and ask me, so who were these people living in Beit Yarach in 3000 BC? And I would say, gee, I don't know. I mean, you know, we don't know who they were. They didn't leave any evidence for who they were. And they said, what do you mean? I mean, are they Jewish? No, but before. Are they Canaanites? No, we don't know who Canaanites were. It's hopeless, you know, so it's nobody. You need to give them a name. Every group has to have this ethnic identification. And this is very strong in Israeli archaeology, both in the way that it is taught and the way that it is presented. And this is, you know, this is a sort of mindset that not all archaeologists do it. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's present there. So that's one form of identity that I think we have to get away from. Now I'd like to get back to our friend Rhode and his exhibit at the Israel Museum. Now here, this is taken from an insert in the Weekend magazine of about 3 or 4 weeks ago in Jerusalem of the National Park Service. And here we're getting away from the national and ethnic, right? Because Rhode is just a good old guy. He's Bob the Builder. He's Rhode the Builder. And he's cute. And he's a little bit like Henry VIII, and a little bit like Queen Elizabeth, and I don't know, Richard the Lionheart or something. Some sort of pastiche here that sort of represents an old-time king. And this old-time king builds stuff. And the insert says, let's go and visit all the sites where he built stuff, and visit the Israel Museum, you know, while we're at it. It was a holiday weekend, and you know. Now, apart from trivializing Rhode and taking away any kind of tension in the story of Rhode, there is an emphasis here on visiting certain sites in which Rhode was active. One of them on this page is Herodion, the site of Herodion. Well, that's in the West Bank. On the next page, there's Sebastia. That's in the West Bank too. There's also Masada, which is in Israel proper and Caesarea, and they're all mixed together. So what you've got here, you're getting a few birds with one stone. In one sense, you're saying, well, it's just Rhode. It doesn't really matter who he is, as long as he was building these fabulous things, and it's fun to look at, and you know, and amazing. And I should have hooked up to do we have internet here? Because I wanted to show you this promotional film, but. Okay, we'll see if we can put that up. Okay, sorry. So, on another level, the occupation is being naturalized in this way. That is, when you put Herodium, Caesarea, Masada, Sebastia all on the same page with the Israel Museum, what you're saying is, by the way, you're in Israel. wherever you are. So there is no Palestinian society at all here. And when the details, it says over here in the Rhode National Park, where is Rhode National Park? It's not 5 minutes from Bethlehem, it's 2 minutes from Tekoa. Tekoa is a little Jewish settlement nearby. So all the place names that are mentioned are only Israeli place names. So that's a way of naturalizing the figure and, the sort of annexation of the West Bank in a cultural sense. I'm not getting it. I'll try once more. Let's see if this works. I want to show you a promotional video for this for the exhibit at the Israel Museum. You getting the sound? Okay, let's run through that again. Because I was fiddling around and you didn't get the full impact of this thing. All right, so we'll do this again. Exciting, isn't it? So I was very impressed. Oops. Get out of this. Okay. So what I found in these promotional films is a complete decontextualization of the entire figure of Herod. And what we're really being told is that there's something mysterious, exciting, and also beautiful and impressive. And the audio tour of this exhibit actually tells you about the immense wealth of Herod, his connections. He knew Antony and Cleopatra. He was Hollywood. He was a celeb. He was a major Roman celebrity. He knew everybody. People wrote about him. He would have banquets and bring in fish sauce from Spain. And pigments from Turkey. And it's really like a description, a breathless description of somebody visiting, I don't know, Donald Trump's mansion or something and saying, look at all those Picassos on the walls, and he got all of these sculptures and stuff like that. And that's how Herod is presented there. And this is what I call the sort of globalized identity. So Israel Museum happens to have this exhibit on Herod. This is as good and as professional and as polished as anything in the Berlin Museum, in the museum in Berlin or at the Met or in the Louvre, it could be anywhere. And the main thing here is who was Herod, who was not what the context of his existence was. When it says Herod built, Herod had this stone brought in from a great distance. He took the trouble to find marble in the quarries of so-and-so. Did he take the trouble? Did he move the stone? There were 10,000 people working there. What do we know about them? Nothing. What do we know about what it was to walk along, show the Temple Esplanade? Has anyone ever written about the sense, what is the individual who walks along the base of this huge, huge, massive wall? What does that do with the individual? What is the impact? What is the ideology behind it? To what extent was Herod Hellenistic? To what extent was he Roman? To what extent was he Arab? Do Palestinians, should they relate to Herod in any way? Can he be perceived as the Idumeans, his home tribe, what was he to them? Was he a guy that turned his back on them? Was he their guy in the NBA, so to speak, you know, in the big leagues? I mean, none of that is discussed because this is just a story of wealth and power. So this globalized approach, to my mind, decontextualizes the archaeology, takes it away from the society and the places in which it exists and makes it everybody's business, but everybody's business in a highly consumerized sense. This is Avdat 2000. You remember Avdat, that same site that had been a beacon of renewing the Negev? Well, it's no longer that, okay? It's something else. It's been reimagined. There's a McDonald's there. You know, it's easy to visit that site. But when you get on the site, instead of getting detailed descriptions of what there is and what the history of the site is, everything has been leveled off and dumbed down, because that's too much information. So there are no signposts with information on them, only labels, things that will say kitchen or market. And then they have these little cartoon two-dimensional figures, which I think is really emblematic, that they're two-dimensional. So you got all these two-dimensional figures that sort of express, in a popular sense, what it meant to be at this site. Oh, this is we all know what a market is. It's where you haggle, you know, that kind of thing. It's very clear what's going on. You don't have to say too much about it. And it becomes easily consumed. Anyone can come there, and immediately they know what they know where it belongs. And it looks like, you know, this is the place that could have filmed Life of Brian. Why not? It's just, it's the same Near East that we know. So this is this is how this globalized identity is. I think it's popular. There's lots of money in it. There's lots of publicity in it, but it's also very flattening. It flattens the past in a way that we should be careful about. So I will come, of course, to what I'm plugging for here, for this poor, impoverished local archaeology. And local archaeology really works on several levels, and sometimes it can be about interaction between people, and sometimes it can be political, and sometimes it can be about landscapes. And I'll show you a few examples here that are familiar to me. This is one example of a community excavation in which I was active around the corner from where I live in the Irganim neighborhood of West Jerusalem. And we have a tumulus there that has several agricultural installations associated with it. And what I and the community center did was to bring in lots of kids and families to excavate there in afternoons during the summer. And we did this over a space of 8 years. So for 2 weeks, every year, we had dozens of kids and their parents coming in. And what this enabled in this specific case was the integration of people with very different backgrounds who came together and formed a sort of excavating community. The community is very loosely, it's a poor community with many recent immigrants, so there's little cohesion within this community. And what the dig did was form a sort of temporary excavating community in which people work together, talk to each other, interact with each other. And it addressed a certain weakness, a certain tension that was in the community, and used archaeology as a way of bringing people together and saying, this is what you've got under your doorstep, or at your doorstep. It's right there, it's right around the corner from where you live. It has a long history. Other people were here before you. They also came from different places in the world and arrived here. They were also at the edge of town, not in the center of things. The government, the king, the palace was a ways off. There's a great view from the top of that mound, and you can actually point that stuff out. This landscape worked in a certain way, and you are not something, you didn't invent, you were not the first people ever to live here, or the first people ever to come from a different country, or first people ever to have to deal with cultural differences. That's one sort of social issue that can be, or some form of local identity that archaeology can work with. Another case is the village of Batir, not far, about 5 miles away from the previous site, which is a Palestinian village just across the border. And here the village itself has initiated a conservation project turning their terraces and their traditional agriculture into a focus of cultural pride and heritage. And what they're doing is not excavating, but studying and reconstructing and rebuilding and making these ancient terraces work in the traditional way, and preserving. They're preserving a past. They're remembering a past and preserving it because that's what they want their children to know in the future. So they're preserving a landscape, and they've actually organized themselves politically and internationally to do that. So that's another version of a local identity through heritage. This is the most difficult case. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. I have to be really brief. In the village of Silwan, there's a neighborhood called Wadi Khilma, and that neighborhood has the bad fortune to have been built on top of ancient Jerusalem, which is known to Israelis as City of David. The mound of ancient Jerusalem is just south, of the Temple Mount. So Temple Mount is not in this picture. It would be just, you can just see the edge of the walls of the old city at the top, above the topmost yellow line. That's the walls of the old city, and the Temple Mount is just beyond that. So this is most ancient Jerusalem. And those of you who followed this a little bit know that there's a lot of dispute around the excavations there, how they're being used to dispossess people, to drive wedges into this community and pry it apart. One of the tools used by the municipality is, or they attempted to change or to give street names in this neighborhood. And these street names, this neighborhood has no street names. This is typical of large parts of East Jerusalem. There are no street names. There are no addresses. This is part of the dematerialization of the people living there, but that's a different story. So, the names that were offered were nice historic names, like King Hezekiah Road, David Stairs, Prophet Jeremiah alleyway, that kind of stuff. But of course that's completely invented. The relation between that and anything physical is just imagined. The local people, for the first time, made a counter offer, saying, we have names for these streets, and here's a series of these names. And each one of those names has a local history attached to it. The one I like best is Al-Mister. It's near the over here, Al-Mister Street. Who is Al-Mister? Al-Mister worked for the British back in the Mandate and got that name, Mister. And then after that, he opened an antiquities shop. And in 1967, the first person to visit him was Moshe Dayan, who was an avid antiquities collector. And because Moshe Dayan visited that shop so often, they paved that road. It was the first paved road in the village. So it's called Mr. Rhode in memory of antiquities collector. So that's a wonderful piece of local history. The other names also resonate. An Ain Street of the Spring, Nazrat El Daraj, the stairway leading down to the El Daraj, to the spring itself, and so it goes. So every one of these names, there's an Al Fukhara Street. Al Fukhara is Pottery Street. Why is it that? They're on an ancient mound. So there's a recognition of this interaction of past and recent past and present in these street names. And this is just like a small sample of what can be done in a village like Silwan. Another aspect, and I've only got a few minutes, right? So I'll try and run through this quickly, is looking at the village of Silwan not as a place which is built on an ancient mound, which is interesting to us only in so much as it's 8,000, 3,000, or 2,000 years old, but looking at the modern village as a place in which people have lived for hundreds of years, which would qualify in many parts of the world for being a proper subject for archaeology. So when you look at the site itself, you can see that the houses have in them a stratigraphy, and each material used, floor added, style of construction represents a different epoch in the history in the modern history of this village, and that can be studied by architects and archaeologists together, probably, to form what we call archaeology of the contemporary past. This is sort of the nickname we have. Dana Berman, who's a London-based architect, studied with Eyal Weitzman in a field called forensic architecture, in which architecture is used, the damages, the defects in architecture are used to represent something. And she focused on these cracks. There are many cracks in the buildings of Silwan. Why? Because they are built in a sort of rough and ready fashion on a very unstable foundation, which is the ancient mound, which is itself made of rubble and of cavities, plus excavations, because people are rummaging around beneath the surface and creating new cavities. So things are constantly collapsing there. So the cracks become an artifact in themselves. And she actually formed a positive of a crack. You can see that in the bell jar. This is a crack which becomes an artifact to be studied as the interface between what's on the surface and what's beneath the surface. And this has, tremendous significance, I think, if you really study it in that way. So this is the kind of stuff that can be done as a creation or as archaeologists working in a community and working with a community to form a local identity. That's what I'm talking about. And this can be done in any part of history. It doesn't have to be, it can be very ancient, it can also be recent or contemporary. So now, we have to go back, and I'll more or less leave this even as an open question. Because imagine, if you will, I said before that Herod was, in some senses, an Arab, and in some senses, Jewish. He's not really part of Jewish culture, by the way. The things that he built are part of Jewish culture, also part of Roman and Hellenistic. He's a very multifaceted personality. And if you take the people that lived at his time, then you're getting into even more variety, okay? So let's imagine for a moment that Israel either reaches some sort of peace status with the Palestinians as an independent nation, or even that there's a binational state. I'm not saying this for political reasons. Just imagine what it means to do archaeology where there is parity, equivalence, equality between Palestinian and Jewish communities. Let's just sort of take ourselves to that situation for a moment. Let's imagine there was not an Israel Museum of Antiquities and not a Palestine Museum of Antiquities, but an Israel-Palestine Museum of Antiquities. How would you present antiquities in that context? How would you create a story that would be accessible to people coming to visit from both ends, okay, and from the world? How would you present Herod to such a community? And I think thinking through Herod can sort of offer you a way in, because you would be talking about things that people have in common as local people, residents in that country, in that land. So it would be about maybe international context, ecological context, environmental context, contact and transmission between cultures, the way ideas circulate, migration, right? Renegotiation of people's identity when they meet each other. Hybridity as a concept, that would be something that would figure prominently. The contemporary past would be something you would be looking at, because so many people have arrived in Palestine in the recent 100 years, on both sides. And they have already created their own history and their own material culture in artifacts that exist on the ground. So looking at all of those things, you can actually imagine an archaeology that would be shared by all of these people by being local. And that is sort of my push of the kind of values that I think can be promoted in an archaeology that would not be detrimental to the future and would answer what archaeology is there for, why it exists. And that is the end of my talk.
Would you like to take some questions? Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
It's hard to imagine the museum that you suggest at the end, which would not be a hotbed of contest um, especially given the modern realities. I suspect that if the Palestinians ever do develop a full-scale archaeological enterprise, that however they interpret what they dig up is going to be in stark contrast to how the Israelis might. But I want to come back to another issue that you raised about archaeology being embedded in capitalism. There's no doubt it is, but I would say it is no less embedded in other ideologies, say Soviet socialism or National Socialism in Germany. Both of those entities utilized archaeology for their purposes. Both were concerned with growth. I mean, all of the things that you described for capitalism applied. Now, we can argue whether they were truly socialist or not, but the fact is that they were different ideologies. There are different ideologies in different parts of the world today where archaeology has virtually the same role that it plays in capitalist societies, in my opinion.
Oh, I think that's a valid point for discussion, how it's used in different ideologies and how, let's say, in what senses capitalist archaeology will be different from socialist. Touring China way back, when it was just emerging from communism, the sites that were presented to the public after the Cultural Revolution were mainly prehistoric sites which belonged to a certain stage in development of humanity that they wanted to emphasize with matriarchal power. That was the emphasis there, and they were pointing out that it was early communism. That's how they presented that. Whereas Ming Dynasty tombs were closed to the public, and they had to find a way of opening them, and they said, well, you're looking at these tombs of kings, but it's not their art. The art was created by the masses, and the kings were only exploiting the masses to make their art for them. That's highly ideological, and it's different, but it's different. It actually created a different way of doing archaeology. So, you're probably right. I haven't really thought that all the way through, but I think there's something to think about there. That it's going to be different, but in that sense, archaeology is value-laden, and when it comes to a society that doesn't have those values, it often does not look like something objective, but it looks like something that's representing a distinct body, something external.
So thank you for your talk. And I guess since we're talking about isms, could you say a bit on whether you think there's also a neo-colonial or colonial aspect to some of these projects?
Yeah, I touched upon that when I talked about dematerialization, because Michael Rollins has written about how colonialism dematerializes the subject. And in that sense, that's something, and in a different talk, we don't have time for that other talk, but I have a different talk prepared that shows how certain aspects of the way archaeology is done today in Jerusalem draw directly and explicitly on archaeology carried out by the British in the late 19th century within a colonial context. So that part of that was saying, we come to a place which has frozen in time. It stopped developing 300 years ago when the Ottomans came. There's nothing important in history. That's why antiquities begin in 1700, because after that time stopped in the Levant and the East. And these people have no appreciation of the past either. They're pretty useless. And we have to get around them, we have to trick them, we have to dig without their knowing it. And basically, they're not part of the discussion at all. And unfortunately, a lot of the archaeology that's carried out today has a similar approach. We carry the torch of Western science in the East, and the people themselves are being dematerialized in many ways. First of all, politically, they're not citizens of anything. They're not citizens of any country. In municipal terms, their houses are termed illegal. They're not real houses because they didn't get building permits. So the houses are there conditionally. They can be made to disappear. Their children are not considered really children because they're constantly being harassed and arrested and treated as adults. You know, so they don't have the protections that children have in most in Western societies. And their history is not real history. It's not important. Silwan doesn't exist. I mean, a colleague of mine actually wrote this in an article. He said Silwan is only on the other side of the wadi. It's not where that site is. So all those streets that I showed you for him aren't really there. So this creation of semi-transparent people is one of the things that colonialism does.
Thank you so much. This was really quite amazing. I wanted to ask you, I mean, to go back to one of the really powerful things that you said in the very beginning, as archaeology is a form of collective memory, and something that really connected well with the examples you were giving towards the end, with you know, public archaeology, examples of public archaeology, which was really exciting. It reminded me of an anthropologist's work in Colombia, Arturo Escobar, who was talking about collective cartography or collective map making, where the local communities, in a kind of a context of global development and kind of it's endangered, they were working in a forest where the whole community would walk through the landscape, and everybody would sort of speak out about particular memories associated with particular names, places, and then that would be actually, this anthropologist was helping them map, you know, that, and I thought it was quite amazing. This is kind of a mapping of shared histories within the landscape.
Mapping is vitally important, and this is something that I don't really take credit for the street naming episode, because that happened without my intervention, but I had asked them just a short time previously, give me the names that you use, you know, for your neighbor, because I don't know them. They're not on any map.
Right.
Tell me those names, and they didn't have them on any map either. So this was the first exercise of their agency, so to speak, within their own village. And it's, you know, it's super important. But you reminded me of an amazing study that I heard described by an ethnomusicologist of a group of people, I think it was in Namibia, I'm not certain, who had a landscape which they sung their way through. They had walking songs that would mention the different places as they walked by. But because of again, globalization, because of a nature reserve that had been created there, they were fenced out of a large part of their landscape, and they stopped singing the songs, and have basically, you know, were on the verge of forgetting this. And what this woman did was she brought them the Jew's harp, this thing that you twang along as you walk, and she said, all right, let's, you know, do the songs and recreate this geography. So I thought that was, you know, that was mind-blowing, that whole concept.
But were they recreating it? This crowdsourcing mapping is fascinating. It's an NGO just got a big grant to do some of it. But the question is, can it become useful politically? I mean, are these street names recognized in any formal way at this point?
Well, of course, what the municipality did was to decide not to name any streets. That was immediately.
So they took King Hezekiah, that got zapped, but
right, both.
Okay.
That's
so
even
opportunity and visibility.
So that was done, but I believe that activity on and in the landscape does create a sort of sense of community and does create political action. And I think we are working very carefully with the Silwan community, because we don't want to impose ourselves as experts, as people who have vastly more resources and power than the local people. There's something there that we have to be very careful about. But I think that we're sort of inching towards a situation in which we can do that kind of study that I presented before, in which the people would be represented, in which they're collecting their own oral history, they're creating their own collection of material culture that relates to their village.
It was closed when I went.
There's no museum, but they're talking about a collection. Oh, there was.
That's a little house.
Yeah, it's not a museum. It just has handicraft, which is another issue. You know, music, handicraft, that's other aspects of culture. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about the instances, I think there are quite a few, where archaeology has challenged the identity of people who base their entire beliefs on text or a textual tradition?
Yeah, this is something I'm less happy to talk about, because I think too often the discussion is taken to that place in which, if you say, well, it's Hezekiah, it's not David, or something like that, or David never existed, then you're being progressive. Whereas that is not actually doing anything for the people, or for anybody. It's a discussion, it could have importance, it could have significance within, maybe in the US, between evangelicals. I noticed there was a lot of stir around this story about these crazy guys excavating in the West Bank. You know, I'd forgotten about that entirely. But that's a very small issue on the ground, but it's a much bigger issue over here, or places where atheists are trying to. And so there's this perception that archaeologists are very progressive people, but I don't judge. I judge people less by what they say and more by what they actually do. So if you have progressive views, but you are excavating on the site, 20 meters away from a house that's scheduled for demolition, and you don't care, and you say that I'm not that, as long as I'm counting my sherds, I'm doing my job, I find that's where the ethical issue lies. And I'm less concerned about an archaeologist who says, I believe every word in the Bible, I just excavated this sherd is, this passage from the scriptures is this sherd. I think that's, it's too easy. It's too easy a target. Anybody can shoot that down.
In dealing with archaeological remains of the distant past, there is not only selection, adaptation, interpretation, but there may also be rejection, deliberate rejection and destruction. A very prominent example is the destruction of the Buddha statues by the Taliban. Are there examples for such an attitude towards remains in Palestine and in Israel?
Absolutely. Again, if I had to present this, I would show how archaeology has become a tool, or has become leveraged by all the stakeholders in Jerusalem, for example. So you've got the Waqf and the rabbinate and the Palestinians and the Jordanians and the Israelis and the UN, and I don't know who I forgot. They all are viewing archaeology as something they have to either use or abuse. The Waqf has to get stuff out of the Temple Mount so people won't find the past there. And there's no end to that. So archaeology has become really it's become part of the problem, part of the issue. And we often say, everyone talks about the settlements, the settlement freeze and all of that. And some of us would like an excavation freeze, because that, it's come to the point where moving antiquities around, every stone that you turn over becomes an issue. And you really, let's let the dust settle a bit. People have been excavating in Jerusalem for 150 years consecutively. And not a quarter of that stuff has been published properly. So there's plenty of, archive work to be done. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes. I think this is a wonderful, and I think we could we can sort of continue the conversation over wine. And I'd like to thank again Rafi.